A powerful millionaire, a stunning girlfriend, and a dinner at the city's most exclusive restaurant. Everything seemed perfect, until he saw his pregnant ex-wife working as a waitress. What he does next will leave you speechless. The evening began with the kind of elegance only a place like Amaretto could promise. Dim lighting, sparkling crystal chandeliers, and a quiet hum of wealth hung in the air like an invisible perfume. Lincoln Davis sat at a table near the grand piano, the faint notes of a classical piece serving as a background to the murmurs of the elite diners. Ruth, his girlfriend, leaned into him, her diamond earrings catching the light as she sipped her wine with a smile that was both polished and detached. Lincoln had grown accustomed to this life. Fine suits, expensive wine, and conversations about acquisitions and market shares. His success had been meticulously curated, like the art on the walls of his penthouse. But tonight, something shifted. As the waiter approached with the menu, Lincoln noticed someone in the corner of his eye, a figure that seemed both out of place and hauntingly familiar. Harper Whitmore, his ex-wife, stood poised with a tray of empty glasses, her face pale under the restaurant's warm lighting. She moved with a quiet grace, though her uniform betrayed her position as a waitress. Lincoln's breath hitched. He hadn't seen her in years, yet the sight of her unlocked a floodgate of emotions. Nostalgia, guilt, and a dull ache he thought he had buried. Ruth was saying something about their upcoming trip to the Amalfi Coast, but her words sounded distant, drowned by the rush of blood in his ears. Harper didn't notice him at first. She was focused on her work, her expression a mask of quiet determination. But when their eyes finally met, her reaction was immediate. Her steps faltered. Her face betrayed a flicker of surprise, then something colder, disdain, perhaps. She quickly looked away, resuming her task as though nothing had happened. Lincoln's chest tightened. He wanted to call out to her, to explain himself, though he didn't even know what he wanted to say. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to still have this effect on him. Dinner continued, though Lincoln's appetite waned. He found himself stealing glances at Harper, noting how different she looked. There was a softness to her now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Her figure, fuller and unmistakably pregnant, added layers to the questions forming in his mind. Who was the father? How had she ended up here? He couldn't reconcile the woman balancing trays and taking orders with the Harper he had known, the ambitious, vibrant designer with dreams as big as his own. By the time dessert arrived, Lincoln could no longer focus. Ruth, oblivious to his distraction, prattled on about the new fashion line she was spearheading. She was dazzling, effortlessly beautiful, yet at this moment, she felt like a stranger to him. Harper, on the other hand, felt achingly familiar, even in her faded uniform and tired eyes. When she approached their table with the check, Lincoln caught her gaze once more. This time, he saw something deeper, a guarded pain, perhaps even defiance. She handed the receipt to Ruth without a word, avoiding his eyes altogether. After Ruth excused herself to take a call, Lincoln seized the opportunity. Rising from his seat, he approached Harper near the kitchen entrance. "Harper," he began, his voice low and tentative. She turned, her posture stiff and defensive. "Lincoln," she replied curtly, her tone clipped. "What do you want?" The question hit him harder than he anticipated. What did he want? An apology? Closure? He wasn't sure. "I didn't expect to see you here," he admitted, his gaze searching hers. She folded her arms over her chest, her expression unreadable. "People have to work, Lincoln. Not everyone has a yacht waiting for them after dinner." The bitterness in her voice stung, but he couldn't blame her. Their divorce had been messy, marked by long silences and unspoken regrets. He had chosen his career over her, and now, years later, he was staring at the consequences. Harper didn't wait for his response. She turned and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Lincoln standing there, a cocktail of emotions swirling within him. When Ruth returned to the table, Lincoln forced a smile, pretending to listen as she recounted her phone call. But his mind was elsewhere, tangled in the memory of Harper's face and the questions her presence had stirred. As they left the restaurant, the night's cold air biting at his skin, Lincoln felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years, a desire to make things right. Not for himself, but for Harper. The following morning, Lincoln stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, coffee in hand, staring at the cityscape that had once filled him with pride. Now, it felt hollow. Harper's face lingered in his mind, her weary expression a stark contrast to the life he had worked so hard to build. He had everything: wealth, status, and a partner who shared his ambitions. Yet the sight of Harper had left him questioning whether it was enough. Determined to learn more, Lincoln instructed his assistant, Evelyn, to discreetly investigate Harper's circumstances. He knew it was intrusive, but he needed answers. By midday, Evelyn had returned with a file. "It wasn't easy," she said, placing it on his desk. "She's been keeping a low profile." Lincoln nodded his thanks, waiting until she left before opening it. The file painted a picture of struggle. After their divorce, Harper had left her corporate job to start a design business. Her early success had been promising, but economic downturns and stiff competition had forced her to close shop. The pregnancy had further complicated matters, leading her to take the waitressing job at Amaretto. There was no mention of the father. Harper appeared to be facing the challenges alone. Lincoln closed the file, guilt settling like a weight on his chest. He had been so consumed with his own life that he hadn't considered how Harper might have fared. The realization stung. He had once vowed to be her partner in all things, yet here she was, struggling while he thrived. That evening, he found himself at Amaretto again, seated alone in a corner booth. Harper noticed him almost immediately, her expression darkening. She approached cautiously, her posture tense. "Back so soon?" she asked, her tone edged with suspicion. Lincoln offered a tentative smile. "I wanted to talk." Her eyes narrowed. "I'm working, Lincoln. I don't have time for small talk." "I'm not here for small talk," he replied, his voice steady. "I want to help." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Harper simply stared at him. Then she laughed, a bitter sound that cut through the restaurant's hum. "Help?" she repeated. "You think throwing money at me will fix everything?" "It's not like that," he began, but she interrupted him. "Then what is it like? Guilt? Nostalgia? You don't get to swoop in and play hero, Lincoln. You lost that right years ago." Her words stung, but Lincoln didn't back down. "I know I can't undo the past, Harper, but I can try to make things better now." She shook her head, her expression a mix of frustration and exhaustion. "I don't need your charity," she said firmly before walking away. Lincoln remained seated, her words echoing in his mind. She didn't need his charity, but he wasn't offering it out of pity. He wanted to help because he still cared, more than he had realized. As the night wore on, Lincoln made a silent vow. He would find a way to support Harper, not because he felt guilty, but because it was the right thing to do. The week following their tense exchange at Amaretto found Lincoln immersed in a plan he hadn't entirely thought through. His life, previously dominated by calculated moves and clear strategies, had veered into unfamiliar emotional terrain. Harper's words replayed in his mind, her defiance, her pride, and the sharp edge of her bitterness. He respected her resilience, but he couldn't ignore the lingering sense of responsibility gnawing at him. Lincoln began by reaching out to contacts in the design world. Though Harper's business had folded, he believed her talent remained undeniable. He recalled the vibrant mood boards she'd once crafted in their shared home, her ability to transform spaces into reflections of the people inhabiting them. That skill hadn't disappeared. If anything, her experiences had likely deepened her perspective. Quietly, Lincoln arranged to have a few influential clients redirected toward Harper, though he ensured his involvement remained invisible. Meanwhile, he frequented Amaretto more than was reasonable. Ruth, ever busy with her fashion empire, didn't question his evenings alone. Lincoln wasn't sure what he expected from these visits. Harper barely acknowledged him, delivering his food with a professionalism that bordered on indifference. But her presence grounded him in a way his luxury lifestyle no longer could. It reminded him of the man he'd once been, before ambition had consumed him. One evening, Harper finally broke the silence. After serving him his meal, she lingered for a moment, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Why are you here?" she asked bluntly. Lincoln set down his fork, meeting her gaze. "Because I care, Harper." She scoffed. "You care now? After all this time?" "I never stopped," he admitted. The words felt vulnerable, raw in a way he hadn't expected. Harper shook her head, her expression unreadable. "Caring isn't enough, Lincoln. It never was." Her words lingered long after she walked away. That night, Lincoln resolved to show her, not through grand gestures or empty words, but by quietly proving he could be the man she deserved. Days later, the first opportunity presented itself. A prominent real estate developer contacted Harper about redesigning several model homes. The commission was substantial, enough to potentially restart her business. Harper hesitated when the offer came, her wariness evident in her voice as she discussed the details with the client. She had been burned before, and trust didn't come easily anymore. But ultimately, she accepted. When Lincoln heard the news through his network, a flicker of satisfaction warmed him. He wanted her to succeed, not because of his influence, but because of her undeniable talent. As the project progressed, Harper seemed lighter during her shifts at Amaretto. Though she still kept her distance from Lincoln, he noticed subtle changes, a touch more energy in her step, a glimmer of pride in her expression. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Harper's success with the real estate project began to ripple through her life. The client was thrilled with her work, and word of mouth quickly spread. Soon, she was balancing multiple small projects, her evenings at Amaretto becoming fewer as her days filled with design consultations and site visits. For the first time in years, Harper felt a semblance of control returning to her life. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was quietly orchestrating these opportunities. The truth came out one rainy afternoon when she visited a local vendor to source materials. The owner, a friendly older man, let slip that Lincoln Davis had been involved in connecting her to a few high-profile clients. Harper's stomach sank. Anger and humiliation flared simultaneously. She hated the idea of being a charity case, even if the opportunities had helped stabilize her career. That evening, she waited for Lincoln at Amaretto. He arrived as he always did, impeccably dressed and calm, though his expression shifted when he saw her standing at the entrance. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. Lincoln nodded, following her to a quieter corner of the restaurant. Once seated, Harper wasted no time. "You've been meddling in my business," she accused. He didn't deny it. "I wanted to help," he said simply. Her eyes blazed. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I needed your help?" "You didn't need it," Lincoln replied evenly. "But you deserved it. You're brilliant, Harper. You just needed the chance to show it." His sincerity caught her off guard, though her anger didn't dissipate. "You don't get to decide what I need or deserve," she shot back. "I'm not some project for you to fix." "I don't see you that way," Lincoln said quietly. "I see someone who deserves every success in the world. And if I can help, why shouldn't I?" "Because it's not your place," she insisted, her voice trembling with frustration. "You can't just walk back into my life and—" She stopped herself, taking a deep breath. "I don't want to owe you anything, Lincoln." "You don't," he assured her. "This isn't about owing me. It's about righting a wrong. I know I failed you before, and I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life. But if there's a chance to make things better, even in a small way, I have to try." His words softened her anger, though they left her feeling vulnerable. She studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of ulterior motives. But all she saw was the man she had once loved, stripped of his corporate armor, speaking from the heart. "I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll earn it," Lincoln promised. "No expectations. No strings attached." Harper didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood, her expression unreadable. "I don't need you to fight my battles, Lincoln," she said before walking away. Lincoln watched her leave, the weight of her words settling over him. He didn't know if she would ever forgive him or let him back into her life. But he was willing to wait. For the first time in years, his priorities were clear. Harper and her happiness mattered more than anything else, and he would do whatever it took to prove that to her. Weeks passed, and the distance between Lincoln and Harper remained. Despite the lingering tension, Harper couldn't deny that her life was beginning to take shape in a way she hadn't expected. The design commissions kept coming, each one more challenging and rewarding than the last. Her calendar was filling up, and for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope about the future. Yet, the knowledge of Lincoln's involvement lingered like a shadow over her newfound success. One crisp morning, Harper sat in her modest apartment, poring over blueprints for her latest project. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the small space she had turned into a functional office. Beside her, a stack of bills reminded her that, despite her progress, she was still far from stability. The baby's due date loomed closer, a fact that both thrilled and terrified her. She had no time to dwell on Lincoln's interference. Her focus had to remain on building a future for herself and her child. That evening, Harper attended a networking event for local designers, an invitation she had almost declined. But as she stepped into the elegant venue, she realized how much she had missed these gatherings. The exchange of ideas, the inspiration drawn from others' work. As she made her rounds, engaging in polite conversation, she felt a renewed sense of belonging. Then, she spotted him. Lincoln stood near the bar, a glass of wine in hand, his presence commanding as always. Harper's chest tightened. She hadn't expected him to be here, though she realized she should have. The circles he moved in often overlapped with hers, especially now that her career was regaining momentum. For a moment, she considered leaving, but something in his expression stopped her. He looked different, less like the composed, untouchable businessman she remembered, and more like the man she had fallen in love with years ago. Their eyes met across the room, and Lincoln began to make his way toward her. Harper braced herself, unsure whether to confront him or walk away. Before she could decide, he was there, his familiar scent and presence disarming her. "Harper," he said softly, his voice cutting through the chatter around them. "Lincoln," she replied, her tone guarded. "I didn't realize you'd be here." "I didn't come to disrupt your night," he said, his hands raised slightly as if in surrender. "I just wanted to see how you're doing." She hesitated, then sighed. "I'm managing." "I can see that," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "You've always belonged here." His words caught her off guard, and she searched his face for any trace of condescension. There was none. Instead, she saw something she hadn't expected: pride. The moment stretched between them, but before Harper could respond, a colleague called her name, breaking the spell. "I should go," she said quickly, stepping away. Lincoln nodded, watching as she disappeared into the crowd. Though their exchange had been brief, it left him more determined than ever to bridge the gap between them. He just didn't know how. Harper's pregnancy progressed, and as her due date approached, the physical and emotional demands became harder to ignore. Her energy waned, and though her career was thriving, she began to question how she would balance everything once the baby arrived. The thought of raising a child alone was daunting, and despite her stubborn independence, there were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. One evening, after a particularly long day, Harper returned home to find a package waiting for her. She frowned, unsure who would send her anything. Opening it, she discovered a collection of beautifully crafted baby items, handmade blankets, tiny clothes, and a note with no signature. The handwriting was familiar, though, and her heart sank. Lincoln. Frustration bubbled within her. She didn't need him to solve her problems or anticipate her needs. Yet, as she held one of the soft blankets, she felt a pang of something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps, though she wasn't ready to admit it. Lincoln's persistence was maddening, but it was also comforting. Days later, Harper found herself at Amaretto again, this time as a guest. She had been invited to a private dinner by one of her clients, and though she felt out of place in the upscale setting, she couldn't decline. As she walked through the familiar space, memories of her time working there came flooding back. She had grown stronger since then, but the experience had left its mark. To her surprise, Lincoln was also at the dinner, seated across from her at the long table. The evening unfolded with polite conversation and laughter, but the tension between them was palpable. Every so often, Harper caught him watching her, his expression unreadable. She avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the client's questions about her work. When the dinner concluded, Lincoln approached her as the others dispersed. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. Harper hesitated, then nodded. They stepped onto the restaurant's terrace, the cool night air wrapping around them. For a moment, neither spoke, the city lights stretching out before them. "I didn't send the package to overstep," Lincoln began, breaking the silence. "I just wanted to help." "You keep saying that," Harper replied, her voice tinged with weariness. "But I don't need help, Lincoln. I need," she trailed off, unsure how to articulate the mix of emotions swirling within her. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost vulnerable. Harper met his gaze, her defenses wavering. "I need to know why you're doing this." "Why now?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I can't stand the thought of you struggling. Because I still care about you. Because I've realized that all the success in the world means nothing if I can't make things right with you." His honesty caught her off guard, and for a moment, Harper saw the man she had once loved, the man who had made her believe in dreams bigger than herself. But the wounds of the past were still fresh, and trust wasn't something she could give freely. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Lincoln said softly. "I'm asking for a chance to prove I've changed." Harper looked away, her emotions a tangled mess. "I need time," she said finally. Lincoln nodded, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll be here." As Harper returned home that night, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there, a tiny spark amidst the chaos of her life. Whether it would grow into something more, she couldn't say. But for the first time, she considered the possibility that Lincoln's intentions might be genuine. And that maybe, just maybe, she could let him in again. Harper's days became a whirlwind of work and preparation for the baby. Her small apartment, once a quiet and solitary refuge, transformed into a hub of activity. Boxes of design samples mingled with baby supplies, and her growing belly reminded her with every movement that her world was about to change completely. The small flicker of hope Lincoln had ignited lingered in the back of her mind, though she wasn't ready to fully embrace it. She couldn't ignore the man he had once been, the one who had prioritized ambition over their marriage. Trust would take time, if it ever returned at all. One rainy afternoon, as she organized a set of fabrics for a client's living room, Harper's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, though she immediately recognized the sender. "Harper, it's Lincoln. I know you're busy, but I was wondering if we could meet. Just for coffee. No pressure." She stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She didn't know him anything, yet a part of her was curious. He had been patient, giving her space and respecting her boundaries, and she wondered if there was more to his persistence than guilt. Finally, she replied, "Okay, tomorrow afternoon, 3 p.m. at the cafe on 6th. The next day, she arrived at the cafe early, her nerves jittery despite her usual composure. Lincoln was already there, seated at a table near the window, his tailored suit an odd contrast to the casual atmosphere. He stood when he saw her, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Harper," he greeted warmly. "Thanks for meeting me." She nodded, taking the seat across from him. "I didn't want to leave you hanging," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "What's on your mind?" Lincoln hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I just wanted to talk. No agenda, no expectations. I thought, maybe we could start over. As friends." Harper blinked, caught off guard by his simplicity. "Friends?" she repeated, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Yes," he said firmly. "I know I have a lot to make up for, and I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I'd like to be in your life again, even if it's just as someone you can rely on." The sincerity in his voice disarmed her. She studied him for a long moment, searching for any hint of manipulation. Instead, she saw a man stripped of his usual bravado, someone genuinely seeking connection. Slowly, she nodded. "All right, Lincoln. We can try. As friends." His smile was subtle but genuine, and for the first time in years, Harper felt a small weight lift from her chest. The conversation flowed more easily than she expected, moving from the baby to her work and eventually to lighter topics. By the time they parted ways, Harper felt a cautious optimism she hadn't anticipated. Over the following weeks, Lincoln's presence in Harper's life became steady but unobtrusive. True to his word, he didn't push or pry. Instead, he focused on small gestures, offering to help with errands, recommending a trusted contractor for one of her projects, and even showing up at her apartment one afternoon with groceries when she mentioned she hadn't had time to shop. At first, Harper resisted. She had spent so long being self-reliant that accepting help felt foreign. But Lincoln's patience wore down her defenses. He didn't try to take over or control her life. Instead, he seemed content simply being there, supporting her in ways that felt genuine rather than intrusive. One evening, after a long day, Harper found herself reflecting on the changes in Lincoln. The man she had once married had been driven, ambitious to a fault, and emotionally distant. But now, he seemed different, more present, more attuned to her needs without overshadowing her independence. She couldn't deny the warmth his actions brought, though it left her conflicted. Was she letting her guard down too quickly? Or had Lincoln truly changed? As her due date drew closer, the reality of impending motherhood became more tangible. Harper began attending prenatal classes, though the thought of walking into the sessions alone filled her with dread. One evening, as she scrolled through her phone, her finger hovered over Lincoln's contact. Swallowing her pride, she sent a message. "Are you free tomorrow evening? I could use some company at a prenatal class." His response came almost instantly. "I'll be there. Just tell me when and where." The next evening, Lincoln met her at the small community center where the class was held. He was slightly out of place among the expectant couples, but he didn't falter. Harper was struck by his attentiveness, the way he listened to the instructor and took mental notes as if he were preparing for a test. When the class ended, she found herself laughing at his bemused expression. "I didn't realize babies came with such detailed instructions," he said, his tone light but genuine. Harper smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing. "Welcome to my world." They walked to the parking lot together, the evening air crisp and cool. Harper hesitated before speaking. "Thank you, Lincoln, for coming tonight. It means a lot." He looked at her, his expression earnest. "You don't have to thank me, Harper. I want to be here, for you and for the baby." His words lingered in her mind long after she returned home. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where Lincoln might play a role, not as the man she had divorced, but as someone who had grown, someone she could trust again. The thought both scared and comforted her. As the days turned into weeks, Lincoln's involvement in Harper's life deepened. He accompanied her to doctor's appointments, helped assemble furniture for the nursery, and even managed to make her laugh during moments of stress. Slowly but surely, he was proving himself, not through grand gestures, but through consistency and quiet determination. Harper still had her doubts, but she couldn't deny the growing bond between them. The walls she had built around her heart were beginning to crack, and with each passing day, she found herself wondering if letting Lincoln back into her life might not be as impossible as she once thought. As the final weeks of Harper's pregnancy approached, her days became a blur of preparation. The nursery, now complete, was a sanctuary of soft colors and delicate details that reflected her designer's touch. Every element felt purposeful, yet there was still an underlying fear she couldn't shake, the reality of raising a child alone. Despite Lincoln's steady presence, she kept a part of herself guarded. She couldn't afford to rely on him entirely, not when the pain of their past still lingered. One late evening, Harper sat on the edge of her bed, cradling a small onesie in her hands. The room was quiet, save for the occasional kick from her baby, reminding her of how close she was to meeting her child. Her thoughts drifted to Lincoln, who had spent the day helping her reorganize the nursery after her latest design inspiration had struck. He had stayed until the late hours, patiently following her instructions as they rearranged furniture for the third time. His willingness to be present, even in the smallest ways, was beginning to chip away at her reservations. The next morning, Harper woke to find a text from Lincoln. "Let me know if you need anything today. I'm always just a call away." She stared at the message for a moment, the simplicity of his words pulling at something deep within her. For so long, she had believed she had to do everything on her own, but Lincoln's quiet reliability was making her question that belief. She replied with a simple, "Thank you," and left it at that. That day, Harper experienced her first false labor. The contractions were sudden and intense, leaving her momentarily panicked. As the pain subsided, she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. Before she could second-guess herself, she called Lincoln. He picked up on the second ring, his voice steady and concerned. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said before she could fully explain. True to his word, Lincoln arrived quickly, his face etched with worry. He helped her to the car and drove to the hospital, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Once they were there, the nurses confirmed it was a false alarm, but the experience left Harper shaken. Lincoln stayed by her side throughout the ordeal, holding her hand and offering quiet reassurance. As they left the hospital, Harper turned to him, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you, Lincoln, for being here." He glanced at her, his expression warm. "I told you, Harper, I'll always be here." The day Harper went into labor began like any other. She had spent the morning reviewing a new client's proposal, her mind preoccupied with work. But as the first contractions began, everything else faded into the background. The pain was sharper this time, undeniable in its urgency. She called Lincoln without hesitation, her voice tight with both fear and determination. "It's time," she managed to say before another contraction hit. "I'm on my way," Lincoln replied, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. By the time he arrived, Harper was already struggling to stay composed. Lincoln helped her to the car with practiced ease, his presence a calming force in the chaos. At the hospital, the hours blurred together in a mix of pain, anticipation, and exhaustion. Lincoln stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and offering words of encouragement. Despite the intensity of the situation, his unwavering support gave Harper the strength she needed. When baby Henry finally arrived, the room was filled with an overwhelming sense of relief and joy. Harper's tears flowed freely as the nurse placed the tiny bundle in her arms. She looked down at her son, her heart swelling with a love she hadn't known was possible. Henry's small fingers curled around hers, and in that moment, all of her fears seemed to fade away. Lincoln stood beside her, his eyes glistening with emotion. "He's perfect," he said softly, his voice thick with awe. Harper looked up at him, her defenses crumbling in the face of his sincerity. "He is," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. For the next few days, Lincoln remained at the hospital with Harper, ensuring she had everything she needed. He held Henry with a gentleness that surprised even himself, marveling at the tiny life in his arms. Watching him, Harper began to see a side of Lincoln she had never fully appreciated. A man capable of immense love and devotion, unshackled from the demands of his once all-consuming career. One quiet evening, as Henry slept in the bassinet beside her, Harper turned to Lincoln. "You've been here through everything," she said, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "I don't know how to thank you." Lincoln met her gaze, his expression tender. "You don't have to thank me, Harper. Being here with you and Henry is all I want." His words resonated deeply, and for the first time, Harper allowed herself to entertain the possibility of a future with Lincoln, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was becoming. When they left the hospital, Lincoln drove them home, his car filled with baby supplies and the quiet hum of hope. As they stepped into Harper's apartment, now filled with the sounds of a newborn, she realized how much her life had changed and how much Lincoln had become a part of it. She wasn't ready to make promises, but she couldn't deny the growing bond between them. Together, they were building something new, something fragile but undeniably real. The days after Henry's arrival were a whirlwind for Harper. Sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the constant demands of caring for a newborn left her feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. Despite the chaos, she marveled at her son's tiny features, the soft tufts of hair on his head, the way his little hand curled instinctively around her finger. Her love for him was overwhelming, filling the spaces she hadn't realized were empty. But even amidst this new joy, Harper couldn't ignore the lingering uncertainty about Lincoln's place in their lives. Lincoln, for his part, was unwavering. He visited daily, always careful not to overstep. He brought groceries, cooked meals, and even took over diaper-changing duties when Harper needed a moment to herself. His patience seemed endless, his quiet devotion a steady presence in the often chaotic rhythm of her days. Harper began to rely on him more than she had expected, though the walls around her heart remained. One evening, after Henry had finally settled into a peaceful sleep, Harper and Lincoln sat together in the living room. The apartment was quiet, the glow of a small lamp casting a warm light over the space. Harper sipped her tea, her exhaustion evident in the dark circles under her eyes. "You've been here every day," she said, her voice soft. "Don't you have other responsibilities? Work, Ruth, your life?" Lincoln leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've put work on hold for now," he admitted. "And Ruth and we ended things." Harper blinked, surprised. "You ended things? Why?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands before meeting her eyes. "Because it wasn't real. I've spent so much of my life chasing things that don't matter. Money, success, relationships that were convenient but empty. None of it compares to being here. With you. With Henry." His words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Harper's chest tightened, her emotions a complicated mix of gratitude, fear, and longing. She looked away, her grip tightening around her mug. "Lincoln," she began, her voice trembling. "I appreciate everything you've done. I do. But I'm still scared. Scared that this is temporary. That you'll realize this isn't the life you want." "It is the life I want," Lincoln said firmly, leaning closer. "I've made mistakes, Harper. I've let ambition blind me to what's really important. But I'm not that man anymore. I want to be here for you and Henry, for as long as you'll let me." Tears welled in Harper's eyes, but she blinked them away. I need time," she whispered. Lincoln nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." In the weeks that followed, Harper began to see a side of Lincoln she had never truly known. He was attentive, patient, and willing to adapt to the challenges of their new reality. He learned how to hold Henry just right to soothe his cries, how to burp him after feedings, and even how to lull him to sleep with a deep, off-key rendition of a lullaby. Harper couldn't help but laugh the first time she heard him sing, a sound that seemed to surprise even her. Henry grew stronger each day, his tiny personality beginning to emerge. He had Lincoln's sharp eyes and Harper's warm smile, a combination that filled her with equal parts joy and apprehension. She caught herself watching Lincoln more often, wondering if this version of him, a man so different from the one she had divorced, could be trusted with her heart again. One rainy afternoon, as Henry napped in his crib, Lincoln offered to help Harper sort through her client files. The two of them sat at the dining table, papers and sketches spread out before them. Harper explained the nuances of each project, her passion evident as she described the designs she had created. Lincoln listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and offering suggestions that surprised her with their insight. "You've always been good at this," he said, admiration clear in his voice. "It's amazing to see how much you've accomplished." Harper looked up, her expression softening. "I've had to be," she replied. "There wasn't much of a choice." "You've done more than just survive, Harper," Lincoln said, his gaze steady. "You've thrived. And I'm so proud of you." The sincerity in his words made Harper's breath catch. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Henry's cries broke through the moment. She excused herself to tend to him, leaving Lincoln alone at the table. As she rocked her son back to sleep, her mind raced. Lincoln's support had become a lifeline she hadn't anticipated, and the walls she had built around herself were beginning to crumble. That evening, as Lincoln prepared to leave, Harper walked him to the door. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. I don't say it enough, but I'm grateful." Lincoln smiled, his eyes warm. "You don't have to thank me, Harper. I'm just glad I can be here." For the first time, Harper allowed herself to consider the possibility of a future with Lincoln, not out of necessity, but because of the man he had become. The idea scared her, but it also filled her with a quiet hope. As she watched him walk away, she realized that maybe, just maybe, second chances were worth the risk. Thank you for listening until the end. What did you think of this story? If you can, leave your feedback in the comments. It helps me improve and motivates me to keep sharing stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and activate the notification bell. I'm sure the next video that pops up on your screen will also touch your heart. A big kiss, and see you in the next story.